Failed ceasefires, a flood of refugees, and relentless Russian airstrikes. Over 1.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country, but millions more are trapped in cities in ever-worsening conditions. Russia promised to hold fire, but are humanitarian corridors being used as a part of a broader strategy? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the crisis of Ukraine's civilian evacuations. Russia has announced new humanitarian corridors for Ukrainians to escape the fighting. The catch is, half of them lead to Belarus and Russia itself. The offer was quickly dismissed by the Ukrainian government, which called it an immoral stunt. Over the weekend, thousands tried to escape Mariupol as ceasefires were announced, only to be violated shortly thereafter. Hundreds of thousands remain trapped there without food, water, or medical aid. From western Ukraine, however, nearly 500,000 people have managed to flee into neighboring Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. Some are managing to be evacuated by air to Israel. Here are the apparent safe corridors that Moscow has offered Ukrainians looking to flee the country. The first route opens from the capital Kiev and moves northwards via Chernobyl and into Belarus. A second route leads from Mariupol in the south to Rostov-on-Don in Russia. An alternate route from Mariupol leads west to Zaporozhye from Kharkiv. A safe corridor has been offered to Belgorod in Russia. There is also an alternate route from Sumy to Belgorod. And finally, a safe corridor south from Sumy, deeper into Ukraine to Poltava. This is the biggest Russian military attack and the largest humanitarian crisis on European soil since the Second World War. So far, Poland has received the single largest group of Ukrainian refugees at over 1 million. Hungary has received nearly 200,000, Slovakia nearly 130,000, Moldova nearly 100,000, Romania more than 70,000, and close to 200,000 have fled to other European countries. Some 400 Ukrainians have fled to Belarus and over 50,000 to Russia. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has warned of a far bigger wave of refugees in the coming months.
We must have a more political vision for our aid to ensure that the international community, first of all, condemns Russia's actions, establishes a coalition to help Ukrainian refugees and support Ukrainians, both who are still on the battlefield and those who have escaped and ran for their lives, who we must welcome, same as we already did. Afghanistan is not a fair example, because we did not host 5 million Afghans in Europe. In this case, we must be prepared to host around 5 million people.
As we pointed out earlier, there have indeed been over 50,000 Ukrainians who have fled to Russia and a small number to Belarus. These have mostly been from the eastern regions bordering Russia. The Kremlin's announcement of humanitarian corridors into Belarus and Russia itself were dismissed by Kiev. A third round of talks being held on Monday between Russia and Ukraine holds out hope that a lasting ceasefire could be negotiated. Now let's go to our panel for today. From New York is Andrij Dobriansky. He's a political analyst and chair of UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. Professor Katarzyna Pisarska joins us from Warsaw. She's the co-founder of the Casimir Pulaski Foundation and the Warsaw Security Forum, as well as the founder of the European Academy of Diplomacy. And completing our panel is George Szamuely. He is in Budapest. He's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. Katarzyna, let me begin with you. The situation in Ukraine is dire, to say the least. Over 1 million people have already left the country. There are reports of indiscriminate attacks on civilians and residential buildings. Tell me, how important is it for a ceasefire to be declared in the country?
I think it's absolutely essential to protect civilians. But also we have a full understanding that there is no willingness on the side of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin to see any ceasefire happening. What is more, Kremlin has not allowed for humanitarian corridors. The ones that were opened were actually shelled. People who were trying to flee were killed. And the new proposals coming out today, which are saying that, well, Russia will agree on humanitarian corridors only if these people flee not to Ukraine, but they flee to Russia and Belarus, is absurd. It is immoral. So yes, we have seen over 1 million refugees moving mainly through the EU border, the vast majority here in Poland. We are sheltering these refugees in the majority in Polish houses as of now. There are no refugee camps here. However, the priority right now is to focus on those who are left behind, especially in cities that are shelled on daily basis, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and a number of other smaller cities. This is a regime that stopped fighting the war with the Ukrainian military because it cannot win with the Ukrainian military. So it's trying to target civilians, innocent civilians, women, children, and it has no incentive to stop because it's trying to kill Ukrainian resistance through targeting civilians. And this is absolutely unacceptable.
George, why won't the Kremlin allow these people to flee where they want to go? Why come up with such bizarre rules that you can go to only a specific location, such as Belarus in the case of people who are trying to flee from Kiev?
Well, the fact is that the Kremlin did put forward humanitarian corridors, and no one used the humanitarian corridors because the militias who are controlling the cities are not allowing people out, and that for a very good reason. The strategy of the Ukraine government, and particularly of these various neo-Nazi Azov battalion types who control a place like Mariupol, their strategy is to keep the civilians hostage so that when the Russians will inevitably go in to take out the Azov battalion, there will be civilian casualties. And then, of course, when the civilian casualties take place, then the media will be on hand to say the Russians are killing civilians. And that's the story. I mean, Ukraine is waging a public relations campaign. It's not really doing very much fighting. So therefore, it's the thrust of this public relations campaign is to say Russia is the horrible villain, and therefore the way you do it is by holding civilians hostage. And that's what's been going on, and that's why these humanitarian corridors that have been established, the two previous days, have not really been made use of.
No,
I'm sorry, but I have to come in here.
Sure,
These are
step in.
bland lies. I rarely use
Please
the
don't
word,
call
but
they're lies. You've already had your say. What you're saying, I'm afraid, is lies, is propaganda.
My friends are being killed. I am on a hotline with many of them in Kiev. No Ukrainian government is holding them hostage.
14,000 people were killed in the Donetsk and Lugansk for 8 years. Did you say anything about that? 8 years that people in the... No, you interrupted me. 14,000 people were killed over 8 years. Did you ever say anything about that?
I don't know. I understand you're a Russian troll. Too bad. As
Don't
the
call me a
facts are
Russian
as
troll.
they are. Nobody is holding people in the cities other than their fear from being shelled. They are shelled on daily basis.
The neo-Nazi Azov battalion, the neo-Nazi Azov battalion that controls Mariupol.
Let me interject here.
Neo-Nazi Azov battalion controls Mariupol has been subjected to
Okay, George, I'll come back to you. And
legislation
Katarzyna, I'll give you time to speak as well, but I have to go to Andrij now. Andrij, now there are people who have fled to countries like Poland, Romania, Moldova, but there are also people who are fleeing to countries such as Belarus and Russia. Tell me, in your view, to what extent Ukrainians are willing to go to countries such as Belarus and Russia amid this war?
Let me just add to the EU countries that also includes Hungary. Hungary does have acceptance areas as well. So those are 4 main countries in EU. As far as people who may be fleeing to the aggressor countries of Belarus and Russia, those numbers aren't they're practically negligible, specifically because of the armed forces that are coming over the Russian border, and as well as the Belarusian military who has crossed over into Ukraine as well and shelling many civilian populations across the north of Ukraine. So heading into danger isn't something that refugees are likely to do. It's very important, however, to point out the fact that even as people are leaving Ukraine, if a civilian area is shelled, and this is what's happening, war crimes are happening because civilian schools, hospitals, children's centers are being shelled by Russia. Those people who are evacuating those cities, the majority are not leaving the country. The majority are just simply going to another town or village close by, and they are joining in the war effort. So it is a full-on war effort, and that's why you see the enormous amount of Russian losses that are happening. 11,000 Russian soldiers killed to this day. Last night, almost an entire airfield of invading Russian airplanes who had landed on a Ukrainian airport had been destroyed. This is happening on a regular basis, and that's why you see scenes of people, even in so-called areas that are already occupied, of Ukrainians rising up. So this is very important to point out that even as we're dealing with a massive humanitarian crisis of the refugees, a majority of people are also staying within Ukraine.
Indeed. George, what is Russia trying to achieve with these humanitarian corridors? If Russia's idea is to bring these people into countries such as Russia and Belarus, that is certainly not working, because most of the people who are fleeing this war are going into Europe. For example, Poland reported today that it has received more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees. That's a very big number, isn't it?
Yeah, but that comes from a different part of Ukraine. The people who are in Mariupol, I think they probably will go to Russia. I mean, remember, Ukraine is a very divided country. The people who are in the east are essentially Russia. They're Russian speakers, they're Russian nationals, they identify with Russia. So, yeah, I mean, remember, Mariupol had actually was under control of the separatists until the Azov battalion moved in and took over Mariupol in 2014. So it's quite likely that they would go to Russia. But I think what Russia is trying to achieve is to get civilians out of the way, out of the harm's way. They're not leveling cities. They're not destroying cities in the way the United States did in Syria and Iraq. There's no Raqqa here. There's no Fallujah here.
Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International have accused Russia of aggression in Ukraine. So that's certainly happening, isn't it?
Well, again, yes, is this aggression of the type that countries have engaged in all the times. I mean, even as we speak, the United States is conducting war operations in Syria without the UN sanction, without the sanction of the legitimate government of Damascus.
Let's assume what you're saying is correct, that the US is doing what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but that does not justify Russia's actions in Ukraine. I don't know what's your point here.
But it does justify because the Russians have already made clear what their issue is. First of all, the issue is the people in the Donetsk and Lugansk who are Russian nationals have been subjected to constant shelling and bombardment for 8 years. Something like 14,000 of them have been killed. So Russia couldn't really put up with that for forever. And then they don't like the fact that Ukraine is being turned by NATO and the United States into a giant aircraft carrier, an anti-Russia directed at them. I mean, we're already now finding out about chemical weapons laboratories, biological weapons laboratories.
That's not true. We can't allow that to happen.
No, don't say that isn't true. As I say, that hasn't yet been confirmed.
Let me bring in Andrij here. Andrij,
it's a possibility.
I see you reacting to what George is saying. Please, step in.
Sorry. If there's blatant disinformation, I just have to point that out about the chemical weapons. I don't know what that is. What is happening, and what we do have to correct, is the fact that yes, civilian population centers are being bombed and shelled. That includes hospitals. That includes assisted living facilities. That includes hospice centers as well. Just the other day, an assisted living facility that was completely fundraised by the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Rabbi Yaakov Bleik, that facility was bombed. And those people were begging for the Russians to stop. It was full of mostly Holocaust survivors. This is what's happening in Ukraine. Innocent people are being attacked by these bombs because the Russian forces cannot handle fighting against the Ukrainian military, which again even at the enormous difference of ratio of the size of the Russian military to the Ukrainian military, there are over 11,000 dead Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory, to the extent that Ukraine has turned to the International Red Cross to come in and deal with the bodies, because clearly the Russian government is not caring about those Russian bodies laying on Ukrainian territory. Somebody needs to give the Russians the dignity. And that's what Ukraine is trying to focus on, the dignity of the people. That's why we're asking for the international community to step in, protect the innocent people, and give the people who are dead the dignity of a proper burial.
We will talk about what kind of role the international community can play in diffusing this crisis. But first, let me come to you, Katarzyna. In one of your earlier responses, you said that you have been speaking to your folks who are present on the ground in Ukraine. Tell me, what are they telling you?
Well, these are horrifying stories. Many we as a foundation were able to convince to evacuate. These are, of course, mainly women and children. Because of the conscription law, men remain in Ukraine. But I would also like to say that the Polish border service has just given a number of 80,000 people who actually, Ukrainians mainly, who crossed the border into Ukraine to fight with Russia. So it's not only the fleeing, but also many men decide, and also women decide to go back. And my friends are telling me again and again that even when they do decide to flee, they're either too afraid because there are no safe corridors, or there's simply no places in the trains that go west. Nobody, I will say, I have spoken to has ever mentioned going east. What is more, people cannot imagine moving now to Russia, to Belarus, so to the country of the aggressor. Yes, they don't feel safe there. They feel that this is the last place where their safety could be assured. So of course they're moving through Poland, through Romania, through Moldova, outside, but the shelling continues. Every hour. It's not a question of daily, it's every hour. And my main question to our pro-Russian friend is, what are the Russians doing in Kiev? What are the Russians doing in Odessa? What are the Russians, if they're protecting Donetsk, what are they doing shelling the main capital of Kiev? Nobody wants Russia in Ukraine. The Ukrainians want the Russians out as soon as possible. They're committing war crimes. I can promise you there is going to be a war tribunal on every single death that Vladimir Putin has caused, whether you like it or not, in your alternative reality.
I think Katarzyna has raised some very good points here, George. Now, if Russia's idea is to protect, as you say, the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, then why is Russia attacking Ukrainian cities which are as far west as Lviv and cities such as Kharkiv and Odessa? What's wrong with those cities?
Well, for the very same reason that I already explained. The goal of Russia has been demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. That's how they spelled it out. They spelled it out over and over again. It's not just a question of, we'll just focus here and that's it. It's a matter of removing all of these neo-Nazi formations. We know about this. There have been any number of articles in the media about the power and the influence of these neo-Nazi formations. We know, Congress passed legislation prohibiting aid to the Azov battalion. So we've known all about this. And of course, they're not just necessarily here. It's a matter of removing them wherever they are. And they are doing it via hand-to-hand combat. They are not doing it by the American way of just simply massively bombing a city and just pulverizing everybody there. So that's why they're giving an opportunity for civilians to leave in order to basically just remove these people.
Okay, Andrij, I see you reacting. Katarzyna, I'll come to you, but I have to let Andrij talk now. Andrij, I see you reacting to what George has to say. Please step in.
With respect to Kasha, thank you for letting me speak. I would just like to point out, first and foremost, that whatever is being said about, I guess one of our colleagues here is obsessed about one battalion in an entire country. I'm not quite sure how an entire battalion can be distributed around an entire, the largest country in all of Ukraine, And it is an incredibly offensive thing to keep on talking about Ukraine as a Nazi country, given the fact that
Yeah, because they celebrate Stepan Bandera. They go
it
putting up
gave
statues to Stepan
most
Bandera.
lives,
Are you a supporter
along
of
with our
Bandera?
Polish
Let me ask you,
and
Mr.
Belarusian,
Dobriansky, are you a follower of Stepan Bandera?
who
Are you a
died
follower
in
of
what
Stepan
year?
Bandera, a Nazi
This man,
collaborator who is
this man,
idolized? Statues are put up to him. There are torchlight parades. People go around with pictures of Bandera at these torchlight parades. This goes on all the time in Ukraine. So I ask you again, are you a follower of Stepan Bandera?
the leader that our colleague is bringing up died over 80 years ago in Ukraine. I don't know
As
why
far
he's
as
obsessed about
Ukrainians are
this.
concerned
Gentlemen,
today,
we don't
about
have
his
time
one life.
to discuss
And
history here. I'm sorry, we
the
don't have time to
one
discuss history here. Andrij, please finish what you have to say. Then I have to go to Katarzyna, and we have to talk about how the international community can help in diffusing this crisis. Andrij.
The one thing I'd add to my distinguished colleague Kasha's comments is the fact that when people are leaving their areas and going towards the West, it's specifically because many people are identified already on kill lists. So to go into a country like Belarus or Russia would be a death sentence for those people. And that's a very important thing that we need to keep in mind. There are many Russian dissidents who are already living in Ukraine. There are Belarusian dissidents, and there are Ukrainian leaders. There are Crimean Tatar leaders. There are religious faith leaders in Ukraine that would be eliminated, shot to death by Russian invaders. So these are people that also need to relocate to the West, and that's a main reason why you're not seeing them in the East.
Katarzyna, what kind of role do you think the international community can play at this point?
I mean, we've been advocating for humanitarian corridors for many days now. The Polish government, of course, allows a lot of humanitarian aid to flow into Ukraine, but it itself is afraid to open a green corridor for humanitarian aid because it's afraid of Russian bombing. I remind you that just a few hours ago, the airport of Vinica has been bombed, and it's just next to our border. This is Western Ukraine. This is not Eastern Ukraine. Lviv is preparing for attack. There were already shellings of some major infrastructure elements. So basically, we are seeing war at the border of the European Union, and the Russians are doing so to scare us, but also most importantly to put maximum pressure on the Ukrainian population, if necessary, to starve the population into obedience. And I can promise you this is not going to happen because the Ukrainians have shown incredible resistance in what they see as a legitimate fight for their independence.
Okay, George, you seem to have very strong opinion on this subject, right? So let me ask you, if you were advising President Putin, what would you tell him? How to diffuse this crisis?
Well, I would say you have to then complete this operation, but you have to then start thinking very seriously about the political future of Ukraine. What kind of a Ukraine is this going to be? There's obviously going to be a kind of a buffer state called Novorossiya. That's going to be in the east. There's probably going to be a central Ukraine, located on Kiev. And then there's going to be the Galician part,
So, George, if I may, we are in the dying minutes of the program. I'm in the dying minutes of the program. I have to ask you this question. You won't tell him, let these people go where they want to go?
Well, absolutely. I believe very strongly that there should be humanitarian corridors and that people should be allowed to leave. Go wherever you want to go. No, absolutely. I think the people who have to do the fighting will be these various militia groups and the Russian army. I don't think civilians should be in harm's way at all.
All right, George, but certainly that's not what Russia is doing right now, right? For example, in Kiev, people are not allowed to go
once the
to Europe. They're only allowed to go to Belarus.
People are not being allowed.
You just agreed with me that you would.
No. The people in Mariupol, they obviously want to go to Russia. I mean, that's who they are. Everyone else, they can go wherever they go. I mean, we're only talking here about these specific city, Mariupol. They said, they're heading.
So in other words, what Russia is doing in Kiev is unjust, right? Because Russia is not allowing people to go to the West.
No. We're only talking very specifically. We're not talking about Kiev. I mean, the people in Kiev, no. I mean, they can go wherever they want to go. The issue is only here in the east, in Mariupol, where they would clearly.
Yes, they can go wherever they want to go, but they cannot go wherever
Right.
they want to go because of the humanitarian corridor.
That isn't true. That isn't true about Kiev. I mean, this is only very specific here in Mariupol, where they're talking about that you can head east. People in Kiev, I mean, they're nowhere near Russia, so they wouldn't be heading towards Russia. No, I think absolutely civilians should be allowed to leave. They can go wherever they want to go. And if you say, and I would definitely urge that for the Russians.
Okay.
But then the rest, there has to be, well, what's the political future? What's the future for Ukraine?
Okay.
And I would think
We're in the dying seconds of the
partition.
program. Katarzyna, I saw you reacting there. Please step in, but please keep your answer very short.
Yes, I mean, as I said at the beginning, the Russian Federation officially said today it will allow corridors only into Russia and in Belarus, especially from Kiev. This is unacceptable for the people. Nobody's going to flee to Russia because that is the aggressor, and this aggression is completely inhumane and unjustified, and there will be a war tribunal. I will repeat that. Vladimir Putin is going to pay for every death and every person who has suffered. And there's millions of these people I see every day live here in Warsaw, but also on the border, on the phones with the people I speak. This is just incredible. Nobody should be going for something like this. And again, we're going to go after Vladimir Putin. I can promise you that.
All right. George Szamuely, Andrij Dobriansky, Katarzyna Pisarska, thank you very much for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.